Good morning, everybody. It is indeed an honor for me today to be here with all of you at the Albany County Hall of Records. On behalf of our County Executive Dan McCoy and our City of Albany Mayor Kathy Sheehan, I welcome all of you here today. We have a great presentation for you to see today. Archives Month for Albany County is very, very important. We are very proud of the fact that we are the only county and city joint records management program in the state of New York, something we are extremely, extremely proud of. And when I travel the state of New York with my fellow county clerks, I always tout what we have here at the Albany County Hall of Records. For those of you that have not been here before, we will have a tour of the facility after the presentation is over with. And just some housekeeping items in case of an emergency. The exit is here to my left, your right, where you came in. There's also an exit into the middle of the building where you see the exit sign going out for any possible emergencies. The restrooms are located right here, the ladies' room and men's room in the hallway. We have refreshments in the conference room immediately following the presentation. And again, we will have a tour of the facility for those of you that have not been here before. And you're going to see quite a gem. We have in our records room facility here, we have the Donegan Charter from 1686, the original Donegan Charter. We have a lot of Dutch collection records from back in the early 1600s here. We have the slave manumission records from the early 1800s. That is very interesting to see. Census records dating back to 1790. We have Civil War allotments and correspondence in the vault in the back. And it's quite interesting to see all these pieces of history that we have stored here. Now today we are going to concentrate and have the program today on the 98 acres in Albany, researching the area demolished for the South Mall. 50 years ago, that happened. 50 years ago, I was 7 years old growing up in the city of Albany, and I do remember this happening. As a young lad, my father and mother used to take me to Lombardo's restaurant on Madison Avenue, and that's where most of the demolishment was going on for the new South Mall constructed area. So I do, although very young, I do remember the demolishment of the South Mall area. I also have many relatives who were union workers at the time, iron workers, sheet metal workers, all of whom worked at the South Mall during the construction. So I also have some family ties to the now South Mall area. And so today, this is really exciting for me. Immediately following the presentation, in the back here, our staff has put together displays of the South Mall demolition and construction. And I think you'll find it very interesting. These are all items that are archived here in the Hall of Records. We proudly go out into the community for African American Month, Irish Month. Most recently we did the Port of Albany during their 100-year anniversary. So we do get out into the community as often as we can here at the Albany County Hall of Records to do displays with the material that we have here. We also did a presentation for the Jewish community. They were very, very impressed with everything that we had. So, you know, if there is a special occasion that you have in Albany County here that you think that the Albany County Hall of Records might be able to get involved with, I encourage you to call us, because our staff here is the best staff that you could possibly have. And they do a lot of hard work, and you're going to see some of the remnants of their hard work today.
Thanks everybody for coming out this morning. This is quite the crowd. Appreciate you taking some of your day to listen to our presentation. On a personal note, I'd like to say that yesterday I became eligible for historic preservation status.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. Just to talk a little bit about the project as a whole, we have three main goals for the project. The first is to build a website that will digitally reconstruct and repopulate the 98-acre area that was demolished for the Empire State Plaza and the South Mall Arterial. So it's basically two parcels, 70 acres, which is the plaza, and just under 30 acres, which is the arterial, coming out to 98 acres in total. We were able to do this because we found photographs at the Albany Institute taken for appraisal purposes that document every one of the structures that was demolished. We also found photographs at the State Archives that document the interiors of about 25 to 30% of the structures, and then the Times-Union graciously allowed us into their photo morgue to scan relevant photographs, somewhere around 300 we estimate. So the first purpose of the project is to build a website that will digitally reconstruct and repopulate the neighborhood. Second purpose is to foster a public conversation about the cost and benefits of urban renewal in Albany. Obviously, the South Mall and other urban renewal projects remain controversial today, and we think that by documenting the neighborhood as it was on the eve of demolition, that we can help contribute to this conversation about the costs and benefits of urban renewal. And third, we think this has national importance. There are neighborhoods around the country, Boston's West End, the west side of Chicago, Chavez Ravine in Los Angeles, and the examples are endless, really, of neighborhoods that were demolished for urban renewal projects in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And we're confident that similar documentation exists and that similar reconstruction projects can and should occur around the country. If you can go back just briefly, no problem.
Just 1 second, Dave. Real quick, I'd like to introduce our Albany County Executive, Daniel P. McCoy, who's here today. Would you like to say something real quick?
Okay. At this point, I'd also like to introduce the full project team. The core team consists of myself, my wife and co-conspirator Ann Fowl, who is also a PhD historian, and a colleague of ours, Stacy Sewell, who is a professor of history at St. Thomas Aquinas College in Nyack, New York, and she is an expert on New York State history, labor history, and African American and urban history. And then we are working on an internal UAlbany grant right now with 2 grad students, Tricia Barbigella, who's been doing historical research, and a lot of it, most of it actually here. Yeah, and Christopher Reese, who is a sociology PhD student and a digital mapping wunderkind. I have no idea what he does, but he does it. He gets it done. Okay.
Are you going to talk about a little bit about what he's doing in terms of
The sample blocks?
Yeah.
Further on, I think.
Okay.
Okay, so these are the appraisal photographs that we found at the Albany Institute. When we first found these a couple years ago, the Albany Institute didn't actually know where these had initially come from. And it's only recently, in the past couple months, that we learned through going through microfilm files at the State Office of General Services that these were taken by an appraisal services company located in Binghamton, New York. Probably the state did not want to use a local appraiser for reasons which you could assume. So brought in an appraisal firm from Binghamton, which took these photographs. These photographs document the streetscapes and the structures. Every one of the buildings has a photograph taken by this appraisal firm. So we're able to reproduce the streetscape using these photographs, and this is 85 through 91 South Hawk Street.
And one of the things that's amazing about these photographs is they were all taken in July and August 1962, just months after the acquisition or the appropriation was announced, but before anything had been demolished.
Right. So we get a sense of what the neighborhood and the streetscape looked like as it was a viable community before the demolitions had started. So it's a remarkable set of photographs.
Sure. And one of the things we've also noticed is that in looking at these photos and really mapping the area, there were several different neighborhoods within this larger 98.5 acres.
Right. It's a very diverse area consisting of several neighborhoods with distinct characteristics. The New York State Archives sent the Department of Public Works sent photographers out, and these are in the New York State Archives, sent photographers out to document the condition of structures when owners of the properties challenged the state's appraisal. This would trigger a court of claims case, so the state would send photographers out to document the structures so that the state could make its case more persuasively in the court of claims. Almost all of these got settled out of court, and very few actually went to trial, but because of this process, the state did exhaustively document photographically the condition of we estimate about 300 of the structures. And this is 29 Grand Street, and here in the middle, so the figure on the left between the cars is a photographer's assistant whose job it was to hold up a sign with the street name and the address and inside buildings, the apartment or floor number. And you can make out a figure here. This is a man named James Strawn who lived at it's 31 Grand Street. 29 Grand Street.
I'm looking at the slide.
Got it. Okay, thank you. So we got interested in James Strawn, who he was, and what his life was like. So we did some research in the newspapers on FultonHistory.com and in Ancestry.com, and we're able to learn something about Mr. Strawn. This is an interior photograph, again, taken by state photographers. Here you see the sign, 29 Grand 29, second floor, second apartment, and this is Mr. Strawn in his apartment. You can get a sense of what the interior was like, the household furnishings, the standard of living, and so forth.
He was about 60 at the time, and he had been living in Albany since sometime in the early mid-40s.
Mr. Strawn is also an off-the-books barber. I don't know if he was licensed or not, but he did some barbering in his apartment. And again, here is the sign, Grand 29 2, and that's the barber chair. And somebody on a Facebook feed called Albany the Way It Was remembered as a girl playing on that barbershop chair. So we learned a little bit more about Mr. Strawn's activities as a result. Next slide.
Oh, but the other thing we learned about Mr. Strawn from history was that he was the leader of a band. And we don't know much about him, but he was advertised around Albany for years and years and years.
Jimmy Strawn and his Sultans.
Jimmy Strawn and his Sultans.
I think initially they were called the Sultans of Swing, right?
Oh, yes, his Sultans of Swing, his swinging Sultans.
Or
Yeah.
Swinging Sultans, obviously predating the
Yeah.
Dire Straits song by many decades.
I think that's one of the Sultans of Swing.
Yeah. Okay, this is another example of a resident in the area. This is a man in his room in a rooming house at 36 J Street. And again, you can get a sense of the household furnishings. This man is representative of a population of about 1,000 single, elderly, often poor men who lived in the area's rooming houses, out of a total population of around 7,000 according to the 1960 census block count. This group, this demographic, these 1,000 single men, will be one of the hardest for us to research because they tended not to leave any historical trace. They tended not to have surviving family, otherwise they wouldn't be living in a rooming house. And we also think that this population was disproportionately harmed by the state seizure of the area because these are men with limited resources. They had found a place to live that was comfortable, perhaps not very spacious, but it was something that they could afford, and the displacement probably affected them more so than a family who had resources and a social network to fall back on. So we may never know who this man was in this photograph. We're optimistic, based on the microfilm records at the State Office of General Services, that we can learn the identity of this man eventually. The state files at OGS thoroughly document every one of the structures, sometimes running into the hundreds of pages, including the names of the residents in the summer of 1962. So we're optimistic that we'll be able to learn more about this population, but quite honestly, this is going to be a population that'll be a research challenge for us to learn about. Yes?
Since he was not a property owner, he didn't receive any compensation of any kind, right?
That's correct, but I should also add that the Division of Housing and Community Renewal had an office in the South Mall area, and tenants who moved were eligible for up to $300 in moving expenses. Obviously, this man doesn't have very much in the line of possessions. You see a couple pairs of shoes, perhaps some changes of clothes. It's probably likely that his personal belongings could fit inside a suitcase or two, so he may not have had the kind of reimbursement for moving expenses that a homeowning family would have. The Division of Housing and Community Renewal's South Mall Project Office did help men like this relocate, find new lodgings, and we have some evidence of that when some of these people wrote letters to state offices complaining about their living conditions. We have an example of that on our blog, a man named Frederick Binsiu who lived at the corner of Chestnut and South Hawk.
Actually an apartment tenant and much more stable than someone
Right.
like this probably would have been. this man, probably rented by the week or by the month, was very unlikely to have a lease.
Yes.
And sometimes men like him, you know, they fall through the cracks of phone books because they didn't have phones. They fall through the cracks of the city directory just because they weren't very permanent residents. And sometimes they don't even show up in some of the documentation we're finding at the Department of Public Works because they're just kind of described as rumors rather
Right.
than as, well, you know,
Right.
proper residents.
Again, this will be a very difficult population to learn about and to research. We are trying to find out whether the Division of Housing and Community Renewal kept the records of the South Mall Project Office or somehow conveyed them to the state archives. So far, we have not been successful. That would be the mother lode of documents for us in repopulating the neighborhood and understanding what the experiences of the population, including this population, was like in 1962, 63, and 64. This was one of our really interesting finds at the State Archives in the series of photographs. I should also point out before I proceed further that these are negatives that we took photographs of, negatives on a light table that we took photographs of, and they're still very high quality despite our best efforts to make them blurry. This is Palumbi's Hotel, and this is in William Kennedy's novel Ironweed. The Palumbo Hotel, thinly disguised, is where the Helen Archer character goes to die at the end of the movie. So this is a direct connection to an Albany, I don't know if icon is the right word I would use, but a connection to a part of Albany's past that William Kennedy dramatized very effectively in his novel, and then the movie with Jack Nicholson and Meryl Streep. This is an honest-to-God flop house, and these cots rented by the night, probably for 25 cents a night. And you can see there are numbers on the wall above each cot. So this is an honest-to-God flop house. The Times-Union was graciously allowed us to scan photographs from their photo library, or photo morgue as they call it, relevant to our project. And this is an example of one of the photographs that they allowed us to scan. This is Lieutenant Governor Malcolm Wilson holding up a map of the take area. And this photograph appeared in the newspaper, and here you can see the cropping lines that the newspaper used to get the photograph to a manageable size.
Well, this is also nice because it shows you the outline of the take area. And you know, we could kind of go through this map and kind of outline the different types of neighborhoods there are in here. So,
Right.
for example, the photo you were showing from 36J is right around in the middle there. Palumbi's Hotel is on Green Street, which is below South Pearl.
Yeah, probably around here someplace.
And Grand is kind of between the two.
Right. Yeah, this does capture the variety of neighborhoods that were in the take area. Obviously, there was a large Italian community centered around Madison and Grand near St. Anthony's. There's the rooming house district on Jay and Lancaster, and there are elegant single-family homes on streets like Elm, Madison, and State Street. So we're thinking of this as a very diverse area socioeconomically, and also ethnically and racially. Another source, this is at the New York State Library, but the Times-Union owns the copyright, and again, they graciously allowed us to use this image. This is a cartoon by beloved cartoonist Hy Rosen, and this is in response to Mayor Corning calling Rockefeller's plan for the South Mall a sterile monument, and here you see the newspaper headline that Rosen is riffing on. And the caption up top reads, "Speaking of monuments, ... and the street sign reads "Down and Out Streets," and here you see a stray dog in the middle of the street wandering. So Hy Rosen and a lot of the editorial staff of the Times-Union and Knickerbocker News were enthusiastic backers of Nelson Rockefeller and the South Mall project both. So this gives a sense of the very interesting political climate that these debates about urban renewal were taking place in. You have an extremely influential activist governor, Nelson Rockefeller, and you have a democratic organization in the city that also has a larger-than-life presence. So the political context is very significant in understanding the decision behind taking the 98 acres and building the South Mall. This is another example of a photograph from the Times-Union photo morgue. This shows the Leonard family. They were the last to leave the take area, and we have a blog post about their experiences. They wanted to stay. The family's house was on Park, right across from Lincoln Park, was the last structure to be demolished, except for buildings that remained as office space for construction. This is taken on December 22nd, 1964. The family had hoped to stay in the house through the holidays, at least through Christmas. But on the morning of December 22nd, 1964, a moving van hired by the state showed up, and the family was basically told to pack and move to their new home on Hillcrest Avenue near the state office campus uptown. So the Times-Union came out with a photographer and a reporter and captured the family's experiences. The Leonard family reached out to us, Mark Leonard reached out to us to tell his family's story and provided us with some family photographs. And this is from 1956 and shows the extended Leonard family on the porch of their house. Another interesting thing about this house, it's not a brownstone row house like nearly all of the structures were. This is a standalone bungalow and had a 3-car garage and was across from Lincoln Park. So it's, again, this represents the diversity of the area that we're researching. This is a Sanborn map sheet held at the Albany Institute and updated through 1961. We're going to be using this as our base map, as the terminology goes. So in other words, we are going to be taking, and the Leonard house is right here at Orr Place and Park.
Right. It's actually where the convent is.
Where the convent is.
Today.
So 10 of the map sheets on this, if you've seen these Sanborn volumes, they're huge. And 10 of the map sheets are relevant to the project. So to talk a little bit about the process of reconstructing the neighborhood and constructing this base map layer, we have high-resolution photographs of these map sheets, 10 sheets. We need to stitch them together into one large photograph, and then anchor that stitched-together photograph onto known geographic coordinate points on the existing streetscape of Albany. And then we have to go back in and assign latitude and longitude coordinates to every one of the structures down to 6 decimal places.
And we're talking about 1,150 structures. That's a
Yeah,
lot.
yeah. There are ways to automate it. The New York Public Library has a Python script that can extract information from the color coding and other symbols on the Sanborn map. But in order to do the full geographic analysis, we need to, as the term goes, as the terminology runs, geocode or georectify each one of these structures. If the if the area still existed, we could simply go into Google Maps and obtain the coordinates for every one of the buildings. But because the streetscape and the buildings no longer exist, we have to do this through other methods.
And to clarify, this is the area kind of a few blocks from the cathedral,
Yes,
the far southern area.
yeah, the southern tip of the take area.
Oh.
Thanks, Barry. The next 2 photographs are from Barry Levine, and Barry's family owned and operated a tavern at Hudson and High Streets, Dinty's Tavern. And this is a photograph of Barry's father, right? And this is Ed Dam? L. Dams, thank you. One of the bar's patrons.
And you will see both of them in the next photo.
And you will see both of them in the next photo, which is Dinty's Bowling League. And Morris Levine is at the extreme lower left, and Barry, you are 2 over right here, right? And Mr. Dams is
Right
here.
behind, yeah.
So we're able to learn a lot from Mr. Levine about his family's experiences and what it was like to live and work at Dinty's Tavern, and we're very grateful for Barry's help.
The top left corner, Red Byron,
Oh.
was a character like Damon Runyon character. And I gave Ann a bunch of his sayings.
Right.
I recognize about half of those people by name.
Yeah.
Okay. What was your average? What was your average?
I don't want to talk about that.
Okay. But he was really good at shuffleboard.
Yes.
Board was my guess.
Another source of another source of photographs and the visual record are from area churches, namely St. Paul's Episcopal and St. Sophia's Greek Orthodox. We're still we're talking to the Catholic Diocese about gaining access to diocese and parish level records, and that's an ongoing conversation. St. Paul's and St. Sophia's were gracious enough to let us into their archive, take notes on whatever we wanted, to scan photographs to our heart's content. So they were very wonderful at throwing open their resources to us. And this is a slide taken in, I think, 1963, and Paul Nance, 63, thank you. Paul Nance, we should acknowledge, a member of St. Paul's congregation, was very helpful in gaining access for us and ongoing conversations about the history of St. Paul's. And also wrote a couple guest blog posts on our 98 acres in Albany.wordpress.com blog post. So this shows you the church. A few years before this, a new rector decided, and Paul, stop me if I'm getting the details wrong. In the mid-50s, St. Paul's Episcopal debated relocating because the neighborhood around St. Paul's had changed, and the congregation was not being drawn from the immediate surroundings. People were coming in from other areas of the city. So the congregation debated whether or not to relocate. Ultimately, the congregation decided to stay and make a stand in the neighborhood and try and beautify it. And one of the ways that the church decided to beautify the neighborhood is by painting the church white. And this is, I believe, in 1960 or 61. When the state announced the take, St. Paul's wrote a letter to Lieutenant Governor Malcolm Wilson and other state officials, arguing that the St. Paul's Episcopal should be left standing in the middle of the South Mall as a church in the green, similar to Trinity Church in the Wall Street Financial District in New York. The state did not like that idea and basically said the entire site needs to be cleared. Next slide.
What street was that on?
Lancaster.
The area, the reason there are cars parked in the front, by the way, is because the rest of the area had already been, parts of the north side of Lancaster had already been demolished at that time.
Right. Also in Lancaster, St. Sophia's Greek Orthodox Church. This is an Easter procession from 1959 or 1960. And you can get a sense of the importance of St. Sophia's to the life of the area. I'm impressed with the spectacular nature of the Easter parade. Go ahead.
One other thing about St. Sophia's is, unlike St. Paul's, there were no plans to move St. Sophia's. In fact, St. Sophia's at the time of 1962 was planning an expansion.
Mm-hmm.
So they were buying up some of the properties around them.
Right. I think you missed one. Or not. Okay. I neglected to include a photograph in this presentation that the state had taken of a classroom where Greek language instruction took place at St. Sophia's.
Yes.
I thought this was in the presentation. I apologize for it not being there.
Yeah, no, it's kind of a strange juxtaposition.
It is, yeah.
Sorry about that.
Another image we found in Erastus Corning's papers at the Albany Institute, and by the way, we also use heavily Erastus Corning's papers here at the County Hall of Records, is this lovely mashup of the South Mall, an architectural rendering of the South Mall, and Rocky giving the finger to hecklers in Binghamton, New York during the 1976 presidential campaign. And of course, the caption on the bottom reads, "Vote Republican." So we don't know who made this mashup, but the meaning is pretty clear that Rocky is flipping the bird to the city of Albany. We've used a variety of sources in addition to the photographs you've seen. Here at the Albany County Hall of Records, we've used Erastus Corning's papers. We've used the tax rolls and the voter rolls pretty extensively.
And Trish used the water rolls.
And Trish used the water rents. Trish Barbagallo, our PhD student researcher. So the resources here have been extremely important for us to understand the political context that these decisions took place in to demolish the neighborhood or the area and build the South Mall, as well as our efforts to repopulate the neighborhood and putting people back in their homes and places of business. Other textual sources and other archives, the Albany Institute has another set of Corning's papers, and I'm not clear on why there's that division. We've also used records of citizens groups like the Citizens Planning Committee, the Center Square Neighborhood Association, and of course, the Albany Institute holds the Sanborn map book that we will be using as our base map layer. The county clerk has a very important set of documents, and these are held here in this building, but are still owned by the county clerk. And these are management agreements and rent surveys that were generated as part of the process of taking the area and then allowing residents to stay in the area for sometimes up to 2 years. We also, you can scroll back, please.
Sorry.
One other class of records that we hope to get are parcel maps, and we're hoping that these may be geocoded and will save us some work, but we'll see. So we're in ongoing conversation with the county clerk's office about the parcel maps and whether or not shape files exist. Other textual sources at the New York State Archives, the Office of General Services, extensive documentation about the demolition and the construction of the South Mall. The Temporary Commission on the Capital City, 10 boxes of records, very important in understanding the political deliberations, the efforts by the state to go out into the city and sell the South Mall to the residents of the city of Albany. So a look into what was going on behind the official reports that the state generated. We've also used Nelson A. Rockefeller's papers on microfilm. The originals are held at the Rockefeller Archives in Sleepy Hollow downstate. UAlbany Special Collections has sources of particular interest and usefulness. One is the William Kennedy papers. Kennedy, before he became a famous novelist, Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist, was a newspaper reporter, an investigative reporter for Knickerbocker News or Times Union?
He was time.
To you. And he did a series of investigations, that's the word I'm looking for, on housing conditions in Albany. And the first drafts of his novel Ironweed are also there. And interestingly enough, we learned that his intention for Ironweed, the original title was called The Lemon Weed, and it was going to be nonfiction, chronicling the lives of two people down on their luck in 1960s Albany, not Depression-era Albany, as a fictional novel. So he intended this to be almost a piece of muckraking or slice of life social realism kind of journalism.
In fact, we just found the original articles that were published in 1964 that were, and anyone who loves Ironweed or has read Ironweed will recognize some of the dialogue, some of the key dialogue from those early pieces of journalism.
Yes. So a very fascinating find that sheds more light on the area that we're researching. Also, the Citizens United reform effort, which ran a mayoral candidate in 1961 and was an organization that opposed the Democratic organization in the 1961 election, and then also contested for state and a congressional office later in the 1960s. A man named Victor Lord is one of the organizers and leaders of the Citizens United reform efforts. His papers are also at UAlbany Special Collections, and they're unprocessed but available to researchers, so we're hoping to get into those soon. And then finally, the Rockefeller Archives contains the papers not just of Nelson A. Rockefeller, but also some of Malcolm Wilson's papers and other state officials. Other textual sources, the OGS, Bureau of Land Management, contains property acquisition files on microfilm. These were generated by Department of Budget, Division of Audit and Control.
By a lot of different places, but collected by Audit and Control, yes.
Right. Those have been very useful in extensively documenting the condition of the properties and the residents of the properties. The names of the residents, very important for us. Church records, very important. St. Paul's Episcopal and St. Sophia's Greek Orthodox. The textual information we were able to get from their archives, very useful. We've gotten some access to the Roman Catholic diocese level records, and we're hoping to gain access to parish level records. We are still looking for the whereabouts of the records of the First Methodist Church, which was taken, was on Phillip Street, and the area archivist for the Methodist Church thinks they may be at Trinity Methodist on Lark Street, but when we talked to Trinity Methodist, they were unaware of any records, so hopefully they survived and someone knowledgeable will be able to point us to them. We're also seeking access to the records of Wilbourn Temple. One of the demographics in the Take area that we are very interested in learning more about is the growing African American community. Wilbourn Temple is located in an old synagogue across Swan Street from the South Mall. They had originally been located on Hamilton Street. I think it's Hamilton, yeah.
Down below South Pearl.
It's down below South Pearl. So their presence in the area, their longstanding presence in the area, would have been very much, the congregation and the individual members of the congregation would have been very likely affected by the South Mall, and we want to learn about those experiences.
You didn't update this one.
Okay, is that the end of the slide? Oh, okay. If you want to learn more about the project, isn't there a slide there? There we go. Yeah, oh, scroll back one, I'm sorry.
No, don't scroll back one.
Okay.
You didn't update it.
Okay. I guess I didn't update it. If you'd like to follow our work, we have a blog at WordPress, and I should explain also that we have two major projects or products, if you will. One is the website where we're going to digitally reconstruct and repopulate the area and then do demographic analysis of the area to see how the area changed over time within the context of the fabric of the city of Albany generally. But we also have a contract with SUNY Press for a collection of photo essays, again, drawing on the wonderful visual resources we found. And that is slated for delivery in the end of 2017. The photo essays on our WordPress blog are basically first drafts of these photo essays that will appear in the companion volume through SUNY Press. We're also doing social media outreach on Twitter and Facebook. If you Google 98 acres in Albany, you should get to our social media empire. We would love to learn more about experiences of yourselves or your families, whether experiences during the demolition, the relocation, or the construction process. I think Bruce had mentioned that some of his family had worked on the South Mall as construction workers, and we'd like to learn more about the experiences of the construction workers as well. So this is the end of our prepared formal remarks. Are there any questions or comments at this point? Yes?
You plan to do a publication of any kind when you're done with this?
Yeah, there's the photo essays that we'll publish through SUNY Press, and we regard the website as a publication as well. We'll probably do more scholarly kinds of publications in professional journals.
One of the things we're talking about looking at is the economics of the area, and Dave is teaching a class and working on a book about the history of capitalism in the United States, the history of thrift. So that connects with his research there.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting relationship. One of the areas I'm researching in my History of Capitalism project is how federal housing policies changed the way that people save and invest. For example, in houses. Using the information from the OGS files, we're able to go back into the 19th century and look at the transactions. So anytime a property got sold, OGS did basically a title search and found out the sales price, the seller, the buyer, and whether or not there was a bank mortgage. So this area had been redlined. Everything below Lark Street had been redlined since the 1930s. What redlining means is that the FHA or VA would not guarantee loans made by banks. It doesn't mean the loans were unavailable. It just meant that they were harder to obtain or more expensive as regards interest rates to obtain. So we want to see whether there is some sort of difference between property sales before about 1935 and property sales afterward regarding the level of involvement of local banks. In other words, whether you see bank mortgages up until FHA financing and the flip side, redlining, and then more alternative financing arrangements afterwards. Yes?
Is there information in these other sources that you have of where the residents who were displaced ended up, percentage-wise, independently of town? They ended up, like you said, in Hillside Avenue, Upper Pine Hills, whatever. And what kind of pressure did that put on the city of Albany in terms of providing housing, or was there housing available at that time?
So, I'm understanding two parts to your question. The first is, where do the people go? And secondly, what about the availability of housing? To answer your first question, we do plan to do this. A lot of people there are 7,000 people who were displaced. A lot of people are going to fall through the cracks. So unless we can find them in, say, a 1965 phone book, we're not going to be able to find where these people moved. So we could possibly, if they moved within the city or county of Albany or maybe to Rensselaer County, we could probably find them in 1965. Residents of the boarding houses are probably going to be a lot harder to track down. So we're going to have to be very aware of that our sample of people we are able, let me rephrase that. The people that we will be able to trace in 1965, there's going to be a selection bias. We're going to be sampling a part of that 7,000 person population in ways that don't reflect the population generally. So we need to be aware of that when we do that kind of analysis. But we will try and do that. We will try and identify. This is an important conversation for understanding the effects of urban renewal, where people went. Second part of your question, there was, when the governor announced the take and unveiled the project, part of the South Mall was to be replacement housing for the housing that was being demolished. And there's only one of those buildings that were actually built. The project was called Roosevelt Terrace, and only one of those buildings was built, and that's the South Mall Tower, which is right off the arterial. So the city of Albany as a whole had a housing shortage at the time, like many American cities. So that's another part of the political context that this played out in, is the state and the city, and I'm not going to assign measures of blame to either, but the state and the city collectively failed to provide the replacement housing that was promised. Yes?
You mentioned complaint letters from tenants and homeowners.
Mm-hmm.
Are they all collected together?
No. Corning's papers at the Albany Institute contain some letters from affected residents. Corning's papers at the Albany Institute also contain canvassers' remarks. Corning sent, and we haven't identified who the canvasser was, sent a canvasser to Madison, Elm, and Jefferson Streets, the area near the cathedral, to take down the remarks of residents. And all of these are negative remarks. So we don't know if there was, again, a selection process here where the mayor was collecting evidence to use as ammunition to forestall the project. We do know that the Citizens United reform effort sent canvassers of their own into the area, and they claim to have interviewed about 1,000 adults, and that the majority of those interviewed by CURE were in favor of the South Mall, even though they knew they were going to be displaced. So we don't know.
Well, they thought it would be good for the city.
It would be good for the city, right. And a vast majority thought it would be good for the city. A smaller majority thought it would be good for themselves and their families, according to CURE.
There are also interviews in both the Knickerbocker News and the Times Union, published, I think, on the 27th, in the March 27, 1962 issues. And again, you get a diversity of responses.
Yeah, and in some cases, residents who were unhappy with, former residents who had been relocated and were unhappy with their new lodgings wrote the city or the state to register complaints about their new apartments. But again, there wasn't any sort of centralized collection process for these letters, and they're kind of ad hoc.
Unless we can find the Department of Housing and Community Renewal files, I think.
Right.
We might be able, if we can find those. And I think we heard they were like in Iron Mountain, or is that, am I making that up?
No, they're
No.
they're in,
Yes.
they're in a
So-
salt mine somewhere.
Yeah, I
apparently.
know. So we're not sure where they are. But
If they
we
exist.
could find those, I think we'd have a better understanding. I mean, I think we'd be able to know the names of all the people who lived in the area and who got reimbursement for moving expenses, and also where they went, where they were living on their first move, which might not be their final move.
Right. But knowing where they moved initially from the take area to their first new residence would tell us a great deal about how the relocation process worked and who is most disproportionately affected by the relocation process.
What was the driver for this project? It's a wonderful project, but what was the driver?
The South Mall project. Oh, this project, our project. Oh, well, we found these photographs and we're like, we could do something that very few, if any, historians have done, and create this project that reconstructs a demolished neighborhood, a demolished area. And also, the University of Albany has a public engagement mission, and I'm formerly the director of the public history program, and I'm a strong advocate for public history, for doing history that has public relevance. So I think those are the drivers. Just the visual information. What I tell people is I applied for sabbatical 2 years ago, and I wrote a sabbatical request that said I'm going to research this book on the history of capitalism. We found these photographs, too good to pass up. So we started doing this project, and then in September I had to write a letter summarizing what I did on my sabbatical. And I basically said, I said I was going to do this thing, but instead I'm doing that. So the photographs really were the driver.
But also, as we're finding more data, more
Yeah.
materials, we realize that actually, the history of capitalism is an important part of this overall story. This might be more academic rather than the
Yeah.
public engagement piece.
Yeah, there's especially how individual housing purchases interacted with national capital flows. And that's what we're finding in the OGS files that document the sales of properties. So that's very preliminary at this point, so I can't really speak intelligently about that beyond what I've just said. Does that satisfy?
But eventually, when you're finished,
Hmm?
we'll almost be able to virtually take a stroll through the south end.
Hmm?
Maybe even walk where the arterial is now. There were some buildings, some factories and so forth.
Mhm.
We'll know the names of the people who live
Yes.
in the various houses and some demographics about them.
Yes, exactly.
That's great. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
How long will that take?
We're hoping, again, by the end of 2017 for both the companion book and the website. As an aside, we just recently learned of a project that a historian at the University of Rochester is doing to digitally reconstruct St. George's in Bermuda. And my first reaction is the next time I do a project like this, it's going to be someplace warm. As an aside, that St. George's project is three-dimensional. And when it's completed, it will allow people to, I guess augmented reality is the preferred term for what this process is. It will allow people to walk through the streetscape like in a video game and even to go into houses. And the streets will be populated with representative types of people who lived in St. George's in 1820 or whichever years the author is doing. We are probably not going to do a three-dimensional gamification kind of thing, but if someone gives us money to do it, we could be convinced. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, are you going to take a snapshot? Will it be a particular year that you're going to represent, and what would that year be?
1962.
Awesome.
At the back.
Any idea what percentage of the buildings were either run down or abandoned at that time in 1962?
Rundown is kind of, it's not a scientific term, and it has an emotional resonance that we're trying to avoid. Let me answer this way. We know from the census, the block level census data, the number of structures that were considered sound, deteriorating, or dilapidated. And 70% of the buildings the census considered sound, 30% deteriorating or dilapidated. The city average was, we have a piece on demographics of the Take area that appeared in all over Albany over the summer. And we did this sort of a demographic analysis there. So I'm trying to remember the exact figures. I think the city of Albany as a whole, let me just say this, that the Take area had more vacancies and a higher rate of deteriorating, dilapidated structures than the city as a whole. That doesn't cast any sort of value judgment on the people who lived in those buildings, because people form families and communities in circumstances not necessarily of their choosing. So there's a national story to this as well. Federal money was involved in most urban renewal projects around the country. This project is the exception, and this was financed by the county, rented back to the state, so there's no federal urban renewal money involved. But cities around the country took advantage of federal urban renewal money, so there is an incentive, kind of a perverse incentive for city officials to declare areas blighted and to get slum clearance money. We are avoiding the terms blight or slum because those are very loaded terms and do not accurately reflect the experiences and living conditions of the people in the area.
But we also are interested, again, in a more academic way of looking at why it was that the census began in 1940 to ask questions about the condition of housing.
Yes.
And to categorize properties as sound or dilapidated.
Right. The census in 1940 begins asking questions about housing condition. In the 1930s, for the first time, the federal government intervenes in the housing market by establishing the Federal Housing Administration, which backstopped or guaranteed loans, and then the flip side, redlining. In 1950, the questions get more sophisticated because of the 1949 Housing Act, which justifies slum clearance and urban renewal. In 1960, the questions again get more sophisticated. So we want to do research. Again, this is maybe more of the academic side of the house. We want to do research on how federal housing policy affected local conditions here in Albany and the relationship between the census and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. As an aside, in the 1960 census, you can learn a lot from going through procedural histories. In 1960, the census considered asking questions about blood type and bomb shelters, fallout shelters, as part of the civil defense program, and decided not to. So, you can learn a lot again from reading administrative histories. So yeah, we're interested in that particular question as well.
One other one. This is going to be, if you have an opinion on this, do you think the neighborhood, if it not had gone through urban renewal, would be a viable neighborhood today?
We have to return back to the period in which these decisions were taking place. So, from the standpoint of the state government and its relations with the city of Albany circa 1960, the state of play was the state had most of its offices downtown but was relocated into the Harriman, what's now the Harriman campus. The plan was to relocate 25,000 state workers to the Harriman campus. The city, and we're learning this through Corning's papers, the city government really wanted the state office jobs to remain downtown with this catch. The city was very happy to allow the state, or wanted the state to remain downtown, but renting commercial office space. So option one, if you will, was to do nothing and allow the Harriman campus to be built up, and this probably would have accelerated an ongoing trend of people leaving the city core and moving to outlying neighborhoods or the suburbs. Option two was to continue doing what the city really preferred, which was not developing the Uptown office campus and continuing to rent office space commercially, the state that is. In talking with some former Department of Motor Vehicles employees who were among the first into the Swan Street building, the DMV was scattered around 8 or 10 different sites in the city of Albany, and it's hard to imagine running a state agency that way. So there's a pressing need for the state to consolidate its workforce. The third option, of course, is what happened, which is the demolition and construction of the South Mall. So,
Which also accelerated
right.
westward movement of the wealthier
Right.
people who were living in the area.
So you really have to get back to the context at the time these decisions are playing out in. They're not playing out in a vacuum. And there are clearly defined options that have consequences, and we can't really run the experiment 3 different times to see what would have happened. Albany faced challenges that every American city faced, at least in the Northeast and the Midwest, in the 1950s and 1960s. The way that I like to explain this in 30 seconds or less, which obviously I'm not doing, before 1950, the major challenge facing city officials and urban planners was how to manage growth. American cities peak in population at the 1950 census. Growth in population, growth in economic activity, growth in geographic footprint thanks to annexations. After 1950, the major challenge confronting city officials and urban planners is how to deal with decline. Decline in population, decline in economic activity. The major tool available to city officials and urban planners was urban renewal, which is a very blunt instrument as we realized collectively in the 1970s and 1980s. Probably more of an answer than you bargained for. But
I was just wondering because there has been a lot of exodus from urban areas.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering how, if that area was left alone, what it would be like today.
we do know that between 1940 and 1950, the area lost population according to the census, and we do know that between 1950 and 1960, somewhere around 20% of the population had left the area. So those are the pre-existing trends. Does that satisfy?
Yeah, it does,
Yeah.
What was the level of public protest about this, either physical or was it played out in newspapers? What were people who maybe didn't live in that area reading about this?
This was one of the puzzles that we had. I'm originally from Chicago, and Chicago had neighborhood organizations that opposed urban renewal projects after the U of I campus and Expressway Interchange was built west of downtown. And I think you need one bad example to mobilize people. So I think that's one response why Albany didn't have much, if any, we're not finding much, if any, organized opposition to the South Mall.
But where you do see individual opposition is in the number of court of claims cases,
Yeah.
you know, that were brought, which was about, I think, maybe a quarter.
About a quarter, yeah,
About a
250 to
quarter.
300.
People who owners, who weren't necessarily residents, but owners, brought their cases to the court of claims.
But that was a very personal thing.
Yeah.
No, it
So
wasn't,
this
but on the
wasn't,
other
yeah.
hand, Mayor Corning certainly encouraged that.
Yes, he did.
And offered free representation in
Right.
Summer of '62. The other place where we see it is in Albert and Kirsch.
Well, the place where we do see organized opposition to urban renewal comes a little bit later, and that's the Center Square and Washington Park areas opposing the punching through the arterial into Washington Park to connect up with Henry Johnson Boulevard and the entrance to I-90 at Livingston and Henry Johnson Boulevard. So that's where we really see the opposition, but that's a bit later. And again, I think you needed a bad example to mobilize people to stop follow-on projects. Yeah.
You know, to put that in context, the analogy I just thought of in this is you needed the demolition of Grand Central, Penn Station to cause the saving of Grand Central Station.
Yeah, yeah.
And that puts Albany in context of not much different than what was happening everywhere. You needed a really bad example that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and that again, put the national context in the way that this project has national significance. Urban renewal and the demolition of areas like this around the country are one of the reasons why you get a historic preservation movement in the mid-'60s and afterward. Historic preservation in many ways is a direct challenge to urban renewal by saying, look, these structures are worthy of preservation. They may be down in the mouth right now, but they can be rehabilitated and not demolished. Yes?
There was an indication, going back a long time, that the reason that housing wasn't built just prior to the demolition was because they wanted to break the back of the Democratic group in Albany. By not building the housing, knock down the buildings, people had to go someplace, and that changed the politics.
We're not clear, we need to do more research on this, and it might be that nobody kept paper trails on this. Why the replacement housing never got built. And, you know, we've certainly heard that this was Rockefeller's attempt to rein in the Albany County Democratic Organization.
But Roosevelt Terrace was really kind of a Rockefeller
Yeah.
sort of project.
And one issue with Roosevelt Terrace was that after the architectural drawings had been submitted and everything was costed out, each unit would have cost somewhere around $40,000, which is astronomical at the time. So that was one reason why Roosevelt Terrace never got built, just the high cost. The people displaced were certainly done a disservice by collectively the state and city governments in not having replacement housing built. So, yeah.
I remember as a non-resident of Albany, hearing about the project, and as a taxpayer at that time, there was quite a bit of concern to those outside the city. You know, funding, I think it was like $1.6 billion. You know, today you multiply that by considerable.
Yeah.
So hindsight is much better than looking forward.
Yeah, the initial cost was $450 million, and it,
Much lower.
yeah.
Factor of 10 almost.
And Rockefeller knew that he would have to finance through the state a project of this magnitude. He would have had a referendum on the ballot, and the voters around the state would have voted. And the consensus was people in Buffalo or Rochester or New York City or Long Island are not going to vote for a bond issue of that size. And this is why the county issued the bonds to finance construction, and the state was a tenant of the county until 2005 or 2006 when the bonds were finally paid off. So that's why there was this kind of unorthodox financing mechanism. It would have been impossible to bond this through the state.
In order to continue the program that we have here at the County Hall of Records, I need to maybe take one more question, and then Dave and Ann will be here afterwards and can field as many questions as you have. But in order to move the program along, I'll take field.
No, go ahead. Move
No,
the
no, go
program.
ahead. No, we're
No, I was just gonna comment on the person that asked about the opposition. I think there were other things going on as well. It was a promise of jobs for people that lived in that area of Albany or the periphery. They weren't being displaced, but there was a promise of employment in construction for a lot of people that remained in the city of Albany. So I know for my ancestors, that was a positive, and why they maybe weren't as opposed to this changing neighborhood, because it promised jobs.
Absolutely, that's a great point.
And just to reinforce that, the state AFL-CIO endorsed Governor Rockefeller for re-election, and I can't remember the last time that the AFL-CIO anywhere in the country would have endorsed a Republican candidate.
The building trades love.
Building trades loved Rocky. Yep, that's a good point. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.